When President Obama was traveling through Europe last month, what was happening back home in Washington was a dramatic, down-to-the-wire, last-minute decision by Congress. It was a last-minute decision to pass a reauthorization of the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act, of course, the controversial bye-bye Fourth Amendment, post-9/11 omnibus national security powers expansion that was first passed during the Bush administration right after 9/11. That law has some sunset provisions in it. Certain parts of it expire unless Congress affirmatively extends them. Congress almost did not extend those sunsetting portions of the Patriot Act, but at the very last minute, they did pass the extension, and they sent the extension to President Obama's desk. President Obama's desk, however, was empty. He was not there. He was in Europe at the time. He was in France, to be specific. And since this was a time-sensitive matter, the White House did not have many options. They put out this, not exactly Orwellian, but sort of scary, futuristic-sounding statement. Failure to sign this legislation poses a significant risk to U.S. national security. The president will, therefore, direct the use of the auto pen to sign it. Auto pen. The auto pen isn't Austrian. It is a robotic signature device that puts a mechanical reproduction of the president's actual signature on a document. Use of the auto pen must be directed directly by the president. Although that happened, the auto pen thing happened 3 weeks ago, now 21 members of Congress are asking President Obama to re-sign the Patriot Act without the auto pen, with just an actual pen in his hand. The only other time the auto pen has ever really made national news was when it was revealed during the George W. Bush administration that Mr. Bush's defense secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, was using the auto pen to sign letters of condolence to the families of soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is probably why the syllables auto pen make lots of people feel like they want to throw up, even if they can't remember why. But another sort of sleeper story in today's news. At one point this afternoon, had our show investigating today whether or not auto pens are ever used at the state level, whether or not they are ever used by governors. The reason we wanted to know is because as of this morning, there were 1,170 bills sitting on Rick Perry's desk in Texas. The deadline for those bills to be acted upon, for them to be made law or vetoed, is Sunday. That's the deadline. 1,170 bills. The Texas legislature meets roughly once in a blue moon. This is all the work they have done during the last session. And Rick Perry has to do one thing or another with these 1,170 bills by Sunday. Unfortunately for the Texas legislature, Rick Perry has been very busy lately, and not in Texas. On Tuesday of this week, he was here in New York City. Governor Perry stopped in at our neighbors across the street to give an interview to a gentleman named Neil Cavuto, who's one of the Fox News Channel hosts. He then gave a rousing speech on Tuesday night to the New York City Republican Party's annual Lincoln Dinner. On Wednesday, he had a private lunch with former New York City Mayor Rudy Giuliani, the kind of private lunch that gets a press release. He also made a stop in North Carolina on Wednesday for the meeting of the Republican Governors Association. Governor Perry finally returned to Texas yesterday, but tomorrow he's back on the road. He's going to New Orleans. Remember, 1,170 bills on his desk. The deadline is Sunday. But tomorrow he is due to be busy out of state again. Look at this. This is the website for the Republican Leadership Conference, which is held every year, and every presidential primary year. It becomes the showcase for people who are running for president. Sure enough, the people speaking at the Republican Leadership Conference this year include Newt Gingrich and Michelle Bachmann and Ron Paul and Rick Santorum. Even John Huntsman, due to announce his candidacy on Tuesday. John Huntsman apparently got a bad cold and felt like he could not travel to make his speech at this event, but he still reportedly sent his wife and daughters, not to give a speech there, but just to sit there and be Huntsmans, because it is that important. You think that the Republican Leadership Conference would have something to brag about with all that, right? They'd be bragging about all the presidential candidates who they've got speaking at their event. Just today, they had Michelle Bachmann and Rick Santorum speaking on the same day. But even on the day those two declared candidates were speaking, the Republican Leadership Conference put up on the front page of their website, on their event website, the guy who is supposedly not a presidential candidate who is not speaking until tomorrow. That's got a sting. But Rick Perry is clearly enjoying this. Did I mention that there are 1,170 bills on his desk in need of his attention by Sunday? Governor Perry's spokesman, a man named Mike Minor, explained what the governor is doing by telling reporters that the governor's priority is on the Texas legislature. And no, we were never able to figure out if Texas has an auto pen. But here's the deal with Republicans running for president this year. There are all these people who are very interesting as candidates in their own right. Ron Paul is always interesting, his particular brand of libertarianism and his wide following among not traditionally Republican constituencies. Herman Cain is a very interesting candidate this year, definitely a real crowd pleaser, if nothing else. Michelle Bachmann is interesting. She has been, frankly, a sideshow of a Republican politician for her career in Congress, but she is trying to mount what looks like a very mainstream and probably well-funded campaign. John Huntsman is interesting, not just because of the head cold family travel issue, but because of his so far quite strange advertisements, hiring the I am not a witch guy and then running his own surreal non sequitur I am not a wizard ads. Also the fact that he is getting into this race so late. He's just been kind of interesting. Newt Gingrich has been interesting as well, sadly in sort of a schadenfreude way. After hinting at running for president for a decade so as to make money off seeming important enough to maybe run for president, after a decade of building up to it, Mr. Gingrich's first real step over the threshold was right onto a rake. Also, Rick Santorum's running. I should never say it that way. I'm sorry. And although maybe the top tier may eventually include John Huntsman, John Huntsman technically isn't in yet. So the real cast of credible contenders, sort of top tier contenders, at this point is only Tim Pawlenty and Mitt Romney. Tim Pawlenty, I think, sort of being considered a credible candidate, mostly on reputation at this point. As we talked about on last night's show, Mr. Pawlenty has yet to get out of double digits in any recent poll. He's been campaigning his heart out. So far, that has only earned him 5% in New Hampshire. That's a new poll. That's up from his last poll in New Hampshire. He's behind Rudy Giuliani, who is not running, and behind Sarah Palin, who is not running. He's only 1 point ahead of Herman Cain. He is polling at half of Michelle Bachmann. And this is not in Iowa. This is in New Hampshire. For whatever reason, things are just not connecting for Tim Pawlenty. As Chris Hayes said on this show last night, there does not appear to be any Pawmentum. So that really leaves as the only candidate in the top tier, Mitt Romney. And while everybody concedes that Mr. Romney is the frontrunner, the widespread and admitted dislike of him among the Republican political class, among people who ran alongside him in 2008, among people who know him, it may be driving the common wisdom now that the Republican field is kind of a hold-your-nose situation. Mitt Romney may be in the lead, but there aren't very many people who are very happy about that. And so there is still this hunting for someone else to please get in. That means Bob Dole literally floated General David Petraeus' name again this week. That means South Carolina Republicans have formed a tiny altar to Chris Christie and have worshipped it in front of invited cameras. It means Rick Perry also. Rick Perry. Apparently forgetting about 1,170 pieces of legislation that he has to do something about before Sunday while he travels around the country lapping up the attention. Nobody knows if Rick Perry is going to get in or not. When he traveled to New York this week, he traveled with his longtime political advisor, who's one of the people who just quit Newt Gingrich's campaign. So that might be a sign that Mr. Perry is running. Venerable Texas political reporter Wayne Slater reported on our air last week that Rick Perry's family is urging him to run. And for a lot of candidates, that's a very important factor. We just don't know yet whether or not he is going to run. He hasn't made an announcement. He has not announced that he's going to schedule an announcement of an announcement. But whether or not he ultimately joins the race, there is one thing to understand about the case that Rick Perry will make, and the case that Rick Perry's supporters will make for why he would make a good candidate and why, by extension, he would make a good president. There's one thing to understand about the case for Rick Perry that is being made so far and that it looks like will be the basis for his presidential run. One thing to understand about that. It's baloney. This is not a story about Anthony Weiner. This is actual baloney. Every time, the visual aid, every time you hear anybody talk about the Texas miracle and why Rick Perry ought to run for president because Texas is in such great shape under Rick Perry's decade of leadership, I want you to imagine this and remember how stupid I looked holding this. Baloney. If we can talk about Anthony Weiner in part on the strength of him having a funny name for 3 weeks, let this be what you think of when somebody tells you how awesome Rick Perry made the economy of Texas.
proud to be a Texan. I'm proud to be a conservative. Not just because I'm from Texas, because conservatives have won the war of ideals. You see, in Texas, you don't have to use your imagination and go, well, what do you think if we tried this conservative principle over here? We've been doing it. We've been doing it, and it's been paying great dividends in our state.
Great dividends. This is the case for Rick Perry for president. The Wall Street Journal lead editorial last week was titled, "The Lone Star Job Surge." Everybody from the Wall Street Journal editorial page to the National Review to everybody else who is encouraging Rick Perry to run is making this case that Texas has this awesome economy. Yes, the national economy may be in bad shape, but Texas has an awesome economy thanks to Rick Perry's 10 years in charge there. After Rick Perry's 10 years in charge in Texas, Texas is a lot of things. But a place where economically everything has worked out awesome? Baloney. Look at the unemployment situation in Texas right now. Texas is in the middle of the pack in the country in terms of its unemployment rate. 23 states across the country have a lower unemployment rate than Texas does. And that stubborn unemployment rate in the Lone Star State has been going up as the rest of the country has recently been coming down. And from the recession until now, wages in the country have gone up 5%. In Texas, they've gone up 0.6%. In California, since the recession, wages have gone up 9.3%. In New York, it was 2.5%. Again, nationally, it was 5%. In Texas, it was 0.6%. In terms of the jobs that Texans do have, Texas has the highest proportion in the country of people making minimum wage and the highest number of people earning minimum wage of anywhere in the country. Nationally, in median terms, American workers are making $12.50 per hour. That's the median wage nationally. In Texas, the median wage is $11.20 per hour. And, by the way, you don't have health insurance. Texas has the highest proportion of uninsured people in the entire country. More than 1 in 4 Texans do not have health insurance. That's the worst of anywhere in the country. And in the face of that, Governor Perry wants to opt out of Medicaid, which is the way you are supposed to get insurance if you are disabled or poor. And the Texas legislature, with Governor Perry's support, just passed a bill to kill Medicare. What Paul Ryan wants to do at the national level, Rick Perry and Texas Republicans are trying to do at the state level. They are trying to privatize Medicare and thereby get rid of it. So in Texas, the unemployment rate's been going up. It has the most people in the country who are making only minimum wage. People overall are making less money than the rest of the country. You are more likely in Texas to have no health insurance than anywhere else in the country. And Rick Perry is working double time to make that even worse. And as Rick Perry travels around to all of these We Love You Rick Perry dinners, he keeps talking about how the federal government can really learn a thing or two about the economy from a place like Texas. Texas right now has the 4th worst budget deficit in the country. That's the fiscal discipline, the conservative principles that Rick Perry has been bragging on. The 4th worst budget deficit in the country at the state level. The only states that have a worse budget deficit are California, New Jersey, and New York. I know what you're thinking. Come on. Texas is such a huge state. It has such a huge economy. Put it in context, Maddow. Be fair. Okay. As a percentage of the state's budget, rather than just in absolute terms. As a percentage of the state's budget, Texas has the 5th worst budget shortfall in the country. But the single most important thing to know about Rick Perry, the thing that motivated us to go out in a giant hailstorm today to buy this enormous baloney, is this. On the same day that Governor Perry asked for stimulus funds, he set up a petition online titled, "No Government Bailouts." He wrote on his Rick Perry blog, "Join our fight and add your voice to a growing list of several thousand Americans who are fed up with this irresponsible spending that threatens our future." That was on the day he endorsed the federal check for $6.4 billion in stimulus money that he was screaming from the rooftops he would never accept. The same day. Join our fight. The day that he's accepting the money. Rick Perry had previously advocated that Texas reject the stimulus money because he said, we can take care of ourselves. In 2009, Rick Perry screamed from the rooftops that he would not accept stimulus money. He then took the stimulus money, and that was the money that filled in 97% of Texas's budget shortfall that year. We've been balancing our budget in Texas. Oh, really? According to the National Conference on State Legislatures, no state was more dependent on stimulus funds than Texas under Rick Perry. Maybe Rick Perry will be the Republican antidote to the Mitt Romney frontrunner blues. But the case for Rick Perry is going to have to be something other than the awesome, conservative, no federal money Rick Perry economy of Texas. I know it's not a story about a guy named Wiener, but it's just as much baloney. By all counts, Governor Perry has many charming qualities. They are going to have to pick something else for him to run on. The good news for Texans in all this, though, is that after headlines like this, look at this, ran in the Houston Chronicle today, Perry flirts with White House run as bills pile up. After that ran in the Houston Chronicle today, the governor finally did make it back to his office today to stop flirting with the presidency long enough to actually sign some of those 1,170 bills, which have just been sitting there waiting for the governor to come back home.